Let's jump right into this explainer, because today we're venturing completely out of sight and down into the dirt. When we think of epic biological survival stories, our minds usually go straight to apex predators on the African savanna or some massive deep-sea leviathan. But right beneath our feet, literally every single second, there is a relentless, high-stakes battle for survival going on. Today, we're exploring the biological life cycle of the earthworm, and as you're going to see, this is absolutely not some dry timeline of a simple bug. It's a full-blown subterranean hero's journey. Now, what's really interesting here is this staggering number, 3 meters. Seriously, that is nearly 10 feet long. We're talking about the potential length of a fully mature giant Gippsland earthworm down in Australia. I mean, that completely shatters how we usually picture a worm, right? But okay, let's bring it back down to the tiny, common earthworms you'd find wriggling in your garden compost. Believe it or not, their journey is no less massive in scale. Whether they grow to be 10 feet or just 2 inches, every single worm shares a uniquely brutal, challenging path to adulthood. I really want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this today. What actually happens when you spend your entire life completely blind, totally surrounded by predators, and relying entirely on eating dirt just to stay alive? To survive those intense odds, the earthworm has evolved an array of phenomenal biological tools. The deck is totally stacked against this creature from the literal moment of conception. So how does it do it? Which brings us to Section 1, a tiny, resilient beginning. Every epic journey has to start somewhere, right? And for the earthworm, it starts incredibly small, as a microscopic lemon-shaped capsule. But, before that capsule can even exist, we gotta talk about how worms reproduce. Earthworms are hermaphrodites. That means a single worm carries both male and female reproductive organs. But they still need a partner to pull this off. When they mate, 2 worms line up belly to belly to exchange sperm and fertilize each other's eggs. And they rely super heavily on this thing called the clitellum. It's that thick, band-like saddle you've probably noticed on larger worms. Once the eggs are fertilized inside, this band literally just slides right off the worm's body, sealing itself into a tiny protective soil cocoon. And let me tell you, that cocoon is an absolute marvel of natural engineering. It is the earthworm's very first line of defense in a really hostile world. It's got this tough, leathery outer wall that's actually resistant to freezing temperatures. It protects against dangerous soil chemicals, and it is absolutely crucial for keeping those embryos from drying out. Depending on the exact species, this resilient little vault just sits there, completely alone in the upper layers of the earth, holding anywhere from 1 to 20 fertilized eggs. It truly is exactly what the source text calls it, a completely self-contained nursery hidden beneath your feet. Inside that buried capsule, there's a quiet but super intense incubation period happening. Now, depending on the temperature and moisture of the soil, this phase can last anywhere from 3 weeks to 5 months. Yeah, 5 months. Warmer, damper dirt basically speeds up the clock. Inside there, those tiny developing embryos are busy absorbing essential nutrients directly from the fluid in the cocoon, growing their organs and basic body segments before they ever even touch the actual soil. Okay, let's dive into this next phase. Section 2, the hungry juvenile years. All right, so when internal conditions are just right, these young worms essentially chew or squeeze their way out of the cocoon. But here's the harsh reality of the situation. Usually, only 1 to 4 hatchlings actually survive to emerge. And from the very first second they're out, they're completely on their own. Survival mode kicks in instantly. They gotta find food. Earthworms are detritivores, meaning they make their living by feeding on decaying organic matter. We're talking dead leaves, rotting plant roots, fungi, and all those bacteria coating the soil particles. Since they obviously don't have teeth or jaws, they use this specialized muscular structure called the prostomium to literally pull that organic detritus right into their mouths. So the crucial piece of the puzzle here is how they process all that material. Just look at this hyper-efficient nutrient extraction system. It's basically a straight tube running directly from the worm's mouth to its tail. Food gets pulled in, hangs out briefly in the crop, and then gets pushed into the muscular gizzard. Now, because worms can't chew, the gizzard acts kind of like their teeth. It uses swallowed mineral particles, tiny little rocks, to grind all that soil and food matter down. Then, the intestines absorb the nutrients before the waste, which we call castings, exits the rear. During this juvenile phase, this digestive assembly line is running at absolute full capacity, practically nonstop, just to fuel their massive physical growth. But eating isn't the whole story. Water is quite literally a matter of life and death here. Earthworms don't have lungs, so they rely on what's called cutaneous respiration. In plain English, that means they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide directly through their moist skin. If a worm's skin dries out, it suffocates. Period. That is exactly why you're always finding them in damp, well-aerated dirt. For these growing juveniles, this is exceptionally dangerous because their skin is much thinner and they haven't developed those protective mucus-secreting cells that the older worms have. And this brilliantly illustrates the vast differences between the phases of a worm's life. On one hand, you've got this highly vulnerable childhood phase. Juvenile worms are almost totally translucent, they lack any reproductive parts, their skin is super thin, and they're just rapidly adding new body segments near their tail to stretch out. But on the other hand, that's the hardy, stabilized adulthood phase. Mature worms have deep pigmentation, thick, hydrating skin, a locked-in segment count, and that fully formed clitellum we talked about earlier. Simply getting from the vulnerable childhood phase to the stabilized adult phase, well, that's the ultimate challenge. Which leads us straight into Section 3, Surviving Underground Dangers. To actually transform from that translucent juvenile into a mature adult, the earthworm has to navigate an absolute subterranean gauntlet. First up, they are entirely at the mercy of the weather. No two worms grow at exactly the same speed. The ideal soil temperature for them sits perfectly between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius. If that soil drops below 10 degrees, their metabolism just plummets and growth pretty much hits a brick wall. When you factor in things like soil pH, the amount of organic matter, and whether the right soil fungi are present, the environment can literally either stall a worm's development for months or fast-track it from an egg to a reproducing adult in under 90 days. And then there are the hunters. Every single phase of a worm's growth invites predators, and the pressure is just relentless. Robins, for example, have incredibly acute hearing. They can actually detect the tiny movements of worms shifting beneath the soil. Moles actively design their entire tunnel networks specifically to intercept worm burrows. And down in the dirt, beetles and centipedes aggressively hunt the young ones. To survive all this, the worm's behavior is totally dictated by defense. They retreat deeper into the earth, they stick to moving mostly under the cover of night, and they can even produce these nasty chemical secretions to make themselves taste terrible. But hey, sometimes evasion fails. Even then, the worm has a pretty amazing trick up its sleeve. Limited regeneration. Say a predator attacks, or a worm loses its tail end while burrowing through some really sharp rocky soil. It can sometimes completely regrow those lost posterior segments. Now actually, let's be clear, it's not full-body regeneration like you'd see in a flatworm, but it is a massive survival advantage. And fascinatingly enough, young worms actually regenerate much more readily than the adults do. Why? Because their cellular activity is already running in high gear thanks to the rapid growth. But what happens when the environment itself turns completely deadly? When they're faced with a severe drought or a freezing cold snap, some earthworms pull out one of the most extraordinary tools in their entire biological arsenal. It's called diapause. This is essentially a biological pause button. The worm tightly coils itself up into a tiny ball, drastically drops its metabolic rate, and just halts all physical growth. They literally suspend their own development until conditions improve. It's a genius way to save their own lives when food and water completely vanish. Finally, we arrive at Section 4, Maturity and Ecosystem Legacy. Let's move along and see how this builds over time. Once they survive the predators, the agonizing droughts, and the freezing soil, they reach the final chapter of their journey. This is where they establish their territory and really leave their mark. Looking at the full life cycle timeline, we've got the incubation period inside the cocoon, which can last up to 5 months. Then, under ideal conditions, it's a frantic 60 to 90 days sprint from tiny hatchling to full sexual maturity. And once they're mature, a common earthworm might live anywhere from 1 to 5 years out in the wild, though realistically, very few actually make it to old age. And honestly, that is entirely by design. The whole biological strategy of the earthworm relies on rapid reproduction to ensure the species survives, not on living a long individual life. So why does any of this matter to us? Why should we care? Well, because as an adult, the worm isn't just surviving anymore. It is actively engineering the entire world around it. As worms mature, they use those powerful circular and longitudinal muscles to push through the earth, constructing these deep, highly structured pathways. This relentless burrowing aerates the soil, creates these crucial channels for rainwater to penetrate deeply, and get this, it actually guides the direction of plant root growth. Throw in the phenomenally nutrient-dense castings they leave behind, and you quickly realize that these creatures are quite literally engineering the very soil that grows the food we humans eat every day. And their incredible contribution, it doesn't even stop when their lifespan does. When an earthworm finally dies, its body decomposes super rapidly in that moist soil. Within a matter of days, bacteria and fungi break down the tissue, releasing massive amounts of vital nitrogen and nutrients directly back into the ground. So even in death, the worm gives back absolutely everything it consumed. It perfectly fertilizes the soil conditions needed for the next generation's cocoon to thrive. It is just a flawless, beautifully self-sustaining loop, from a tiny lemon-shaped capsule through an absolute gauntlet of predators and environmental extremes, all the way to becoming a master ecosystem engineer. So, here's my question for you. The next time you step outside into your yard or walk through a park, I want you to look down at the dirt and ask yourself, what hidden, high-stakes battles are raging right beneath your feet at this very second to fuel the next generation of life? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer to explore this wild underground world today.